the co-medical directors for AgelessRx, and I've been a physician for over 40 years. And the first 15 years of my practice, I was a standard medical doctor, and I lived in the Colorado mountains. And while I was there, I did all of the things that a normal family doctor would do. I wrote prescriptions for antibiotics and blood pressure medicine. I set broken bones. I delivered babies and everything that I was taught in medical school. But after about 13 years of being a standard doctor, I became disenchanted with regular medicine. And I felt that there were many things that I was missing as a doctor to help my patients. And I started studying more natural remedies, herbals and vitamins and supplements and intravenous therapies and things along those lines. And much to my surprise, I found that patients not only did as well with these type of natural remedies as they did with the prescription drugs, in many cases, they did better with less side effects. So I changed my entire practice. And after 15 years of being a small town conventional doctor in the mountains of Colorado, I moved to Denver and began a practice of nutritional medicine. And I've been doing that ever since, and I've never looked back. About 2002 to 2004, I ran into a man by the name of Ray Kurzweil, who I'm sure you all know. And Ray and I became friends, and we decided to write our first book together. And in 2004, our first book, Fantastic Voyage, was published, and it became a bestseller. And in that book, we tried to outline the subtitle of that Fantastic Voyage was Live Long Enough to Live Forever. And the idea was we don't really know how to live forever or even much longer than people have lived in the past, but it's going to happen soon. Medicine is changing so quickly. So the idea is live long enough to take advantage of what's coming in the near future. So that was what we outlined, a program for doing that. And then we followed up with another book in 2010, Transcend. And now Ray is getting ready to come out with, he wrote The Singularity is Near Before. And next year in 2024, The Singularity is Nearer will be published, his latest book. So medicine is changing extremely rapidly, but some things are fundamentally the same. So today, what I'd like to do is talk about blood sugar and insulin, because I think that controlling blood sugar and keeping insulin levels at a low level is one of the most profound and positive things that anyone can do to both stay healthy, prevent our major killers like heart disease and cancer, and extend our lives. The good news is, in most cases, it doesn't really cost anything to do this, because we can lower our insulin levels and lower our blood sugar by the dietary choices we make, by the lifestyle choices we make with respect to our weight and exercise and things like that. So with this kickoff, I'd like to have Dr. Z join me, and we can both talk about this profoundly important topic, blood sugar and insulin.
Well, thank you very much. I apologize. I was in the waiting room. I had some technical issues. Thrilled to be here again. Thank you for taking the time. So I should put my phone on Do Not Disturb. But yeah, that book, Fantastic Voyage, it's the book that got me into functional medicine, and then longevity medicine is kind of an extension of functional medicine. So I have both books on my shelf, right behind me here. So wouldn't be here without those books. So it's a pleasure being here. I'm really thrilled that Dr. Grossman is joining us as medical advisor. Now, in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, we want to talk about blood sugar, insulin sensitivity, and how that relates to health, longevity, chronic disease, preventing chronic disease. So we have some slides prepared today. We're going to go over them, discuss them, and if anybody has any questions, we'll be happy to field some questions. I think we have some people who've already submitted some questions.
Okay, great. So with that in mind, I'm going to begin to share my screen with you. And I have a PowerPoint ready with some slides that will help direct the beginning of our conversation. So
Yeah, the visuals are always very helpful in helping understand, especially complicated topics.
So here's the presentation. So this is what we'll be talking about, is blood sugar, and not just insulin levels, but insulin sensitivity. And there's a difference between the level of insulin in your body and how sensitive your body is to insulin. So insulin is actually a very large molecule, and its purpose is to serve as a chaperone. When you eat glucose or sugar or starches that turn into sugar, or even protein, which ultimately turns into glucose or sugar, there is no way for that glucose to enter the cell where it can be used as fuel. Glucose fuels the body. It's one of the chief sources of fuel for the body. Without insulin helping it to get inside the cell. So insulin is truly a double-edged sword. It's one of those things where a little bit is good, a lot is bad. None is worse. So we need a little bit of insulin to remain healthy, to help us to utilize the sugar in the food we eat, but not too much. And what happens is if we eat a diet that's very high in either sugar or starches, and the starches turn into sugar very readily, our insulin levels will rise. And the body will deal with this for a certain amount of time, years, in fact. But after a few years of having this barrage of insulin, insulin isn't the most benign molecule. The body starts to protect itself. And insulin works less well and less well. And we find that as the years pass and people continue to eat a high sugar, high starch diet, they develop what we call insulin resistance, which is exactly the opposite of insulin sensitivity. And we have tests that we can measure, and we do this in our clinic on all the patients that come in, and we measure their blood sugar, we measure their insulin levels, and we also measure their insulin sensitivity. And the lower their insulin sensitivity, the better. So that's our goal, is to have low insulin sensitivity, and that will correspond to really the way we're living our life. So with that in mind, let's look at some things that relate to glucose, blood sugar, and insulin. So one of the things that's shocking in terms of what's going on in our modern world is very few people, and we're talking like 1 in 7 or 1 in 8, have optimal blood sugar and optimal insulin levels. So it's less than 15% of Americans. So 85% of the population has suboptimal levels of either blood sugar or insulin, and we'll go over specifically what those numbers are. So the higher your blood sugar, the more insulin your body needs to produce. So if you eat a high sugar diet or a high glycemic diet, we call it, high glycemic foods are typically foods that turn into sugar readily, like a white potato is a high glycemic food, white bread is a high glycemic food, a lot of processed grains like white rice and things like that. These are all high glycemic, meaning they turn into sugar very readily, and then the body needs to produce more insulin. Well, insulin does move the blood sugar or glucose into the cells where it can be burned for fuel. But as I mentioned, insulin is a double-edged sword. When it's low, it's great. And when it's high, what's the problem with having a high insulin level? Well, one of the things that insulin does is it causes you to retain sodium. And when you retain sodium, you retain water, you become bloated, and your blood pressure tends to go up. So one of the first things that happen when people have insulin resistance, in other words, they've eaten a lot of high glycemic or sugary foods, their body can't deal with that constant barrage of insulin. They become resistant to it, the body needs to produce more and more insulin all the time. And we get the conditions that are set up for insulin resistance. So that's actually a bad thing. And the next few slides come from this article from the British Medical Journal called "Insulin, Too Much of a Good Thing is Bad." And that's exactly incorporating this concept that a little bit is good, but a lot is bad. So what happens?
Now, so I was going to say, I mean, when I explain this to patients, I think it's more specifically kind of like the spike and crash phenomenon that people get, where you eat a high carb meal, high starch meal, you get a spike in your sugar, your pancreas freaks out, and oh my God, there's so much sugar, don't know what to do with it, spits out a lot of insulin, kind of like code red type of thing. And then a lot of times you get a crash, and then you're hungry again, and then you go to eat more carbs, you get a spike again, and a crash. So it's like this vicious cycle of spiking, crashing, spiking, crashing, spiking, crashing. And I think it seems to be that elevated level of insulin over and over and over again, year after year after year. I think that's when the receptor starts to become mute to the insulin. I liken it to being in a always having the alarm go off. If your car alarm goes off every single night, eventually you just ignore your car alarm, or you become less and less sensitive to it.
Well, that's a very good point, Dr. Z, and thank you for sharing that, because you're absolutely right. And another thing that happens when you eat a high sugar or high starch meal and your insulin level goes way up is sometimes the insulin does such a good job of moving the glucose into your cells that you become low blood sugar or hypoglycemic afterwards, which is often manifested by increased hunger. People will eat a big plate of pasta, for instance, and it's not unusual for them 2 hours later to be really hungry. So having high insulin seems to increase your appetite, so people gain weight, and it's like a vicious cycle. So it's really insulin too much of a good thing is bad.
Yeah, just kind of jumping ahead a little bit, we have a lot of patients that we put on metformin, and metformin can help with insulin sensitivity. We actually have a lot of patients who report that they don't get that or as much of a crash after a carbohydrate meal. I think because it sensitizes insulin, and you don't need as much, so your pancreas ends up not overshooting as much. I don't know if you've seen that phenomenon in some of your patients or not.
No, you're absolutely right. I agree with what you're saying. And towards the end of our presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the things that people can do, because no one wants to not be able to ever eat sugar or not to be able to ever eat starch. I mean, these are fun foods to eat, and we don't want people to have to suffer for the sake of their health. Obviously, we want to make good choices, but there are things that we can do that will blunt the effects of eating sugar and eating starch, and that can be helpful to us, and everybody can do that. So one of the things that we discussed already was having a high glycemic or sugar starch diet will lead to high insulin, which will in turn lead to weight gain. So one of the things that insulin does is it promotes lipogenesis. That means it's fat formation. So when your insulin level goes up, it tells you to make more fat, which directly leads to overweight. So insulin therapy, when you take every once in a while, you have what we call type 2 diabetic. The type 2 diabetics are the ones that are not the ones that need to give themselves shots of insulin most of the time. They're the ones who the insulin resistance gets worse and worse and worse over the years, until finally they cannot make enough insulin to lower their blood sugar, in which case they need to go on medications to help them do that. Well, in the worst case scenario, even the normal type 2 diabetes medicine, such as metformin, don't work anymore. And those patients need to be put on insulin. And when they are, they gain massive amounts of weight. So we know that insulin therapy will promote weight gain. And we know that a high insulin level will predict weight gain, particularly in children. So I like to measure insulin levels in my patients. And if they're high, particularly associated with insulin resistance, I'll suggest to them, changing their diet and really reducing the starches and the sugars quite a bit. We do know that with pharmaceuticals, such as the metformin that Dr. Z mentioned a few minutes ago, pharmaceutically, we can lower insulin levels, and this will help to lose weight and decrease the incidence of obesity. So this is one of the things that a high glycemic index diet can do. High insulin will lead to weight gain. Another thing that insulin can do is has many adverse health consequences. So hyperinsulinemia is the medical term for simply high levels of insulin in the bloodstream. And we know how we get those, eating the high sugar starch diet. So the insulin acts on the insulin receptors, and then the insulin receptors indirectly affect this enzyme called mTOR1. And mTOR1 is one of the most talked about enzymes in anti-aging medicine today. We hear about people taking rapamycin, people taking different types of peptides and other strategies to lower their mTOR1 levels. Well, why do we want to lower mTOR? Well, mTOR, number one, it leads to synthesis of lipids, making more fat. Number two, having a higher level of mTOR blocks or interferes with this process called autophagy, which is one of the ways the body destroys harmful cells. So each of us forms, it's estimated, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 cancer cells a day, and we rely on our immune system engaging in autophagy, digesting them away, eating them up. Well, if we have high levels of mTOR, we're not going to do that good a job, so high insulin levels will increase our risks of cancer as well. Through another pathway, high insulin levels will lead to cell proliferation. Well, what's the quintessential disease characterized by cell proliferation? Cancer. So sugar is the only food that cancer cells can eat. So when we combine a combination of a high sugar diet with high insulin levels so that we can proliferate these cells, it's almost like a setup for helping cancer cells to grow. So whatever we can do to eat a diet that's lower on that sugar scale, to lower insulin levels, I think will translate to better health and better longevity for us.
Yeah, I just want to highlight that mTOR connection there. So there's a lot of talk about what activates mTOR, what inhibits mTOR. And, a lot of people say, oh, you should avoid methionine and other kind of amino acids and things like that. I think even though mTOR is considered to be a nutrient sensing pathway, I suspect, and based on what I've spoke to with a lot of experts, that insulin resistance is probably one of the most potent activators of mTOR. I think it dwarfs protein intake and levels of branched chain amino acids and things like that. So that gets into the whole debate. I mean, we don't want to touch on this today, but just kind of maybe a topic for another day. The whole debate between moderate or high protein diet versus low protein diets, which low protein diets tend to be higher in carbs. And so, are you really doing yourself a favor by completely cutting out proteins and going so high in carb? In which case, you're probably adding a lot more fuel that way to this mTOR fire. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up here real quick. It's something that's being more and more recognized, and I haven't heard too many people talk about it.
Absolutely. And just while we're on the topic, before we move on, another great way of lowering mTOR1 levels, and there are two mTORs, mTOR1 and mTOR2. mTOR1 tends to be more harmful, mTOR2 more beneficial, but by intermittent fasting, by doing some time restricted eating, where we go 14, 16, 18 hours a day without eating any calories at all, we can also downregulate mTOR and lead to these beneficial health consequences.
Yeah, that makes sense, because when you're fasting, your insulin should be nice and low, especially if you're fasting for extended periods of time.
Absolutely. So the previous slide kind of suggested ways in which high glucose, high insulin levels can increase the risk of cancer. Well, this slide suggests how high insulin levels can increase the risk of our number one killer, which is cardiovascular disease. So once again, high blood levels of insulin will, over time, the body just can't deal with all this insulin and becomes insulin resistance. And when you have insulin resistance, it means it takes more and more insulin to push the glucose into the cells. And then you get the adverse consequences of those high levels of insulin. And then finally, the body cannot make enough insulin anymore. to push the glucose in the cells, the blood sugar begins, or glucose begins to rise, and then we have type 2 diabetes. So that's kind of the pathogenesis, the origin of type 2 diabetes, which, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, is at truly epidemic levels, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. But what this shows is as we eat this type of diet that leads to high insulin levels, our body develops insulin resistance. This leads to high blood pressure, the retention of sodium, endothelial dysfunction, which all are things that will in turn lead to cardiovascular disease. So our two biggest killers, cardiovascular disease and cancer, are reduced by a low glycemic diet and are enhanced by a high glycemic diet. So anything we can do to keep our sugars down and our insulin level down will prevent these two major killers. This was a study recently published, and they did biomarkers. And what the biomarkers they did were taken from the Leiden longevity study. And there were 35 biomarkers that they followed. And they said that of those 35 biomarkers, glucose, in other words, blood sugar, insulin, and triglycerides or blood fats were the biomarkers that were chiefly associated with healthy aging. And they met all four of the criteria that they used in this Leiden longevity study. So given that glucose and insulin are two of the three biomarkers that lead to healthy aging when they're low, it makes a lot of sense that we keep our glucose and insulin levels down.
Yeah, it's funny they throw in triglycerides. When I see elevated triglycerides, to me, it's, you've got metabolic syndrome until otherwise proven otherwise,
Absolutely right. I mean, well, so how do you get high triglycerides? By eating too much sugar,
yeah.
or
drinking too much alcohol, or drinking too much alcohol, which usually has a lot of sugar in it, or the alcohol itself gets converted.
Absolutely. So, what's our clinical definition for diabetes? So, doctors say that if a patient has a blood sugar level when in the fasting state of 125, that is consistent with diabetes. If their blood sugar 2 hours after a meal, PP stands for postprandial, after a meal, if 2 hours after the meal their blood sugar is still over 200, that's highly suggestive of diabetes. And or there is a measurement called hemoglobin A1C, which is an average of your blood sugar for the previous 3 or 4 months. And if that's 6.6 or higher, that suggests diabetes. So most diabetics, all three of these are true. But there's an even more common condition called prediabetes. It's not as bad, but diabetics, for instance, have triple the risk of having a heart attack. Having prediabetes, you still have double the risk of getting a heart attack. So it's not a benign condition by any means. So just because a person doesn't truly have diabetes and they have prediabetes, that's not a wholly benign condition. And how is prediabetes defined? Fasting blood sugar between 100 and 124, the 2 hour after meals glucose 140 to 200, and the hemoglobin A1C 5.7 to 6.5. So what's a normal hemoglobin A1C? 5.6 or less. And a normal fasting blood sugar, well, it isn't really below 100 either, as we'll see shortly. But we have diabetes and prediabetes, and these are truly at epidemic proportions. There's been a 15-fold increase, and this is not just the United States, this is worldwide, over the past 35 years since 1985. In 1985, there were 30 million type 2 diabetics worldwide, and now it's increased 15 times to 462 million as of 2020. And this constitutes almost 5% of the world population. So given the fact that type 2 diabetes can shave as much as 15 years off of your life expectancy, this is truly a serious epidemic. In the United States, it's estimated that 37 million Americans have diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and it's more common the older you get. People over the age of 20, in other words, adults, about 1 in 9 are diabetic. And for people over 65, more than 1 in 4 are diabetic. So this is really a serious problem that we need to take steps to reduce, because healthcare costs are really spiraling completely out of control. And I think one of the reasons for that is we have so much type 2 diabetes going around, which just generates healthcare costs on multiple levels.
But
So
like we talked about before,
risk,
well, one thing feeds another. I mean, having elevated insulin levels, for example, it's not just the diabetic risk. We talked about cardiovascular risk. We talked about, cellular proliferation. So that's the cancer risk. And of course, dementia, and Alzheimer's is one of the most common dementia. There's this thought that the brain can't properly access glucose anymore. And that leads to cognitive decline. So it's all, a lot of doctors try to put these different diseases in different buckets, but at the end of the day, it's just one big bucket. It just all depends on kind of where you scoop, sort of thing. And that's probably why, having metabolic dysregulation and insulin resistance leads to so much disease and sick care spending. It's not really healthcare; it's more like sick care spending.
Absolutely, and even some physicians have taken to referring to Alzheimer's disease as diabetes of the brain, because
type 3. Yeah, I've heard the term type 3 diabetes.
Exactly. So, and Alzheimer's, unfortunately, is another epidemic that's possibly being aided by the high sugar diet that we're eating nowadays. So, what's the chance that someone who was born in 2000 will get diabetes? Amazingly, for Hispanic women, it's over 50%. More than half of Hispanic women will develop type 2 diabetes at some point in their life. Even the lowest risk, which is non-Hispanic white males, they have almost a 30% risk. So everybody of every type, ethnicity, and background, whatever their gender, has a significant risk of developing type 2 diabetes, which is contributing to this epidemic. Diabetes increases death from all causes 2.5 times. So this is looking at the hemoglobin A1C, and they're saying, okay, at a level of 5.5, which is the upper limit to normal, they call that the risk of death 1. But we see that as we get to 6.5, which is the upper limits of prediabetes, it's about 1.5 times. And it just keeps going up and up and up. And as we get up to hemoglobin A1C of 9.5, we're about 2.5 times the mortality, and it just keeps going up from there. So the worse the blood sugar control, the shorter people can expect to live. So it is a serious problem.
I was going to say, the thing about this graph, it's almost logarithmic, although it makes it look linear, because you go from 0.5 to 1 to 4.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so it's a little misleading. It's actually it's a lot more disturbing if you actually because I think it starts to take off quite a bit, almost like a logarithmic. The other thing that you mentioned is the differentiation between prediabetes and diabetes is like they have to pick a number, so they kind of pick 6.5 as a cutoff. But it's not like you just wake up one day, you're normal, and then all of a sudden, oh my God, I got 6.5 A1C. It's a progression over years. So all that damage has already been done over years by the time somebody gets to a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes.
Absolutely.
And that's why there's a risk, years before somebody even becomes diabetic. The good news is there's a lot of things that can be done. We'll kind of talk about those towards the end.
Right. And you'll see this caption down here. If we're able to decrease hemoglobin A1C 1 point, in other words, we go from 7 to 6, we'll have a significant decrease in mortality. So prediabetes affects a lot more people than diabetes. 96 million Americans, more than 1 in 3, have prediabetes. And amazingly, 8 out of 10 don't know they have it. They did a meta-analysis of 87 studies involving more than 951,000 people. And in this study, just having prediabetes, no diabetes, just prediabetes, increased the relative risk for cardiovascular disease, almost 2.5 times, more than 2 times for cardiovascular disease mortality, 1.5 times for total mortality, 3 times for heart attack, and 2.25 times for stroke. So, I mean, diabetes is bad, but even prediabetes is significantly bad as well. So we need to really look at our blood sugar. How do we define prediabetes? Generally, they say a waist circumference, and that's measured at the belly button, not your pant size. So if you take a tape measure around your belly button, it needs to be less than 35 for men, less than 40 inches for women. If you don't have that, you get a point. If your triglycerides, your fasting triglycerides are greater than 150, or you're on medication to treat triglycerides, you get a point. If your HDL is less than 40 for men or less than 50 for women, you get a point. If your blood pressure is greater than 130 or over 85, or you're on blood pressure medicine, you get a point. And then finally, if your fasting blood sugar is greater than 100, you get a point. If you have 3 of these, then that makes the definition of prediabetes. And we have all these millions of Americans that currently have prediabetes, which then leads to all of these problems associated with it. So how about if you don't have diabetes and you don't have prediabetes, and we say prediabetes is blood sugar 100 to 125, how about if you have a blood sugar of 95 or 85? So they did an interesting study, 2,000 men between 40 and 60 years of age. They followed them for 22 years, and they found out if you had a fasting blood sugar greater than 85, your relative risk of a heart attack or cardiovascular death was increased by 40%. So this is my definition. I call fasting blood sugars between 85 and 100 as high normal. And this is an independent risk factor for heart attack, cancer, and death. So we really need to be looking for fasting blood sugars of less than 8.5. I haven't seen any studies that have optimized the hemoglobin A1C levels, but in my clinic, I use a level of 5.3. I like people to have hemoglobin A1C 5.3, 5.2, 5.1 or less if at all possible. So we have an epidemic of high normal. That's between 85 and 100. 85% of adults have fasting blood sugar over 85. And that's why I say this is really, affecting only, a small percentage of Americans have good blood pressures. But the thing is how it's changed over the years. In 1976, only 25% of people had fasting blood sugars over 85. But by 2009, 85% of us had fasting blood sugars over 85. So it's become an increasingly worrisome problem. So here's our definitions. Fasting blood sugar greater than 125, diabetes, 11% of the population. Fasting blood sugar 100 to 124, pre-diabetes, 33%. 86 80 to 99, that's where most of us are. We call it the high normal range. And yet only 13%, basically 1 in 7 people or so, have an optimal blood sugar between 70 and 85. And then a couple percent of us have low blood sugar. So this is what we're shooting for, is fasting blood sugar between 70 and 85. And yet most of us are not there. So how do we do that? What's our anti-aging toolkit to bring blood sugar levels and insulin levels down? Well, number one, most important of all, is a healthy lifestyle. Let's cut back on the sugary and starchy foods. I mean, it's not that we can't eat them, but let's eat less of them. Let's get more exercise and keep our weight down. All of these things, exercise actually drives sugar into your cells so you don't need as much insulin. Weight loss, the more weight you have, the more insulin you need to have to drive the sugar into the cells. So all of these are things that will lower your insulin levels, lower your blood sugar. I personally believe that most people over the age of 35 should consider taking metformin. Metformin is a diabetes drug. I've been on it for about 20 years. I've never had any side effects from it. I like to think that it's one of my main tools that I use for creating longevity for myself. One way we can determine how well we're doing with keeping our blood sugar under control is we can measure our hemoglobin A1C, which will give us our, just measuring a blood sugar, that tells you what your blood sugar is at that 1 second. But the nice part about the hemoglobin A1C is it kind of integrates it and averages it over a few months. And then there's the continuous glucose monitors, the little patches that people can put on their arm, and that will hook to an app on your phone, and you just press a button on the app and you know what your blood sugar is. And most people don't need to use this continuously. This is more for diabetics to use continuously, but for people that just want to know, they find, for instance, well, pasta doesn't really bother me, but if I have a baked potato, my blood sugar goes through the roof. Or if I have a baked,
watermelons,
blood sugar goes nuts. And everybody's
watermelons, watermelons, grapes. Yeah, there's a wide variety of, there's a wide range of things that people don't realize. Quinoa. I can't tell you how many people think quinoa is such a healthy food, but it tends to spike people's blood sugar.
Yeah, so you can get CGM, use it for a few weeks or a few months, and at the end of that time, you'll probably have a pretty good idea of which foods are going to spike your blood sugar and which foods are okay for you. And then, if it's a food that you really love, I just can't live without pasta. Yet pasta shoots my blood sugar up. In that case, you can take a medication called acarbose. Acarbose is a medicine that causes the blood sugar to not rise so much after you eat starch. So we have solutions that we can use, but you need the information first. So the lifestyle.
So let's pause here for a minute. I know in your book, Fantastic Voyage, you mentioned I think you introduced, it was the first time I'd ever heard anybody talk about the oral glucose insulin tolerance test. Do you want to talk about that for a minute, or do you want to save that for
No,
later?
That's fine. Conventional doctors will perform very commonly a glucose tolerance test. So
used to, I think A1C is mostly supplanted that, but it's still done in pregnancy. During pregnancy, it's done for almost all women.
Yeah, absolutely. You give a patient a certain amount of glucose, and then you measure their blood sugar 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and 120 minutes later to see what happens to it. But what I did in my clinic is says, let's see what happens to the insulin at the same time. So we got to measuring fasting blood sugar and insulin before and after drinking the sugary water to see what would happen. And I found a lot of interesting things over the years as I've done that glucose insulin tolerance test, I call it. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up because I think a lot of our listeners also listen to Peter Attia and The Drive, and he just released I think it's AMA 51, I think, Ask Me Anything at 51, where they kind of talk about that. Now, Peter Attia makes it sound like this is something new, but like I said, you brought it up in your book, Fantastic Voyage, 20 years ago. So I mean, the information's been there, for at least 20 years. Just as an aside, AgelessRx tried to develop an at-home insulin glucose tolerance test, but we could not find an at-home lab that could accurately measure insulin. And we're still looking. So if we do happen upon a lab that can accurately measure insulin from like a finger prick or one of those devices you can wear, otherwise what happens is you have to go to a lab and spend half a day there, or at least 2 hours there, getting your blood drawn several times in order to properly get a chart for it. And that's part of the reason why it's fallen out of favor.
Yeah, exactly. So other lifestyle choices, this comes directly from this article about insulin resistance. And they said that lifestyle modification should be the primary focus when treating insulin resistance. So meds are not the first line. Lifestyle is number one. Nutritional intervention, calorie reduction, avoiding carbs that stimulate excess insulin is the cornerstone. So that's our starches and our sugary foods. Physical activity tends to increase energy expenditure, and it also makes our muscles more sensitive so that they can absorb sugar without requiring so much insulin. Medications then are our last resort to improve insulin resistance if we need to.
Yeah.
So the first,
this is another rabbit hole we could go down, but hormones, male and female hormones have a big role in insulin resistance and other resistance syndromes as well. And that's typically why women tend to have so much trouble, with weight gain during that transition for menopause. And also why if a man has is severely deficient testosterone, they also have issues with weight gain as well. So that's yet another factor. I mean, nutrition is great. Physical activity, again, these are kind of like, the solid base that you have to have. Sleep is also kind of the solid base that you have to have. But there are other things as well. Maybe one day we'll kind of, dive a little bit deeper into those. But I just wanted to put those out there because sometimes you do need more advanced therapies for some conditions.
Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. So as we move from lifestyle to medications, metformin is the most commonly prescribed type 2 diabetes medicine in the world. It's been around a long time. It's quite safe, and it's available through Ageless. So I've been taking it for a long time, like I said, about 20 years. And I think that most people, number one, it seems to promote longevity, at least in virtually every animal that has been tried on. Number two, it seems to prevent cancer, both prevent and treat. So every cancer patient in my clinic gets it. And I urge people to take it to prevent cancer as well. So I think that taking metformin is a cornerstone of everybody's anti-aging toolkit. It's derived from this French lilac. I want to leave enough time so we can answer some questions. So I'm going to go through the rest of these slides fairly quickly. There's only a couple left. This is what the CGM, the continuous glucose monitor device, looks like. It's just a little disc that goes on your arm. Then you don't need to keep doing the blood sugar, sticks with the lancet and things like that. And you can know what your blood sugar is anytime after any different food. And you can't buy this over the counter. You need your doctor to write your prescription for it. And Ageless will be able to help you to do that. You get your CGM, measure it for a month or two, and you'll find out which foods would be the offenders for you that will raise your glucose and insulin levels. If they do, you find out that certain foods do. After using the CGM, you find out that certain starchy foods lead to these blood sugar spikes. You can take acarbose. What acarbose does, it slows down the breakdown of starch and the sugar. So these spikes don't happen so readily. And you can experiment. If you use your patch, you find out, okay, well, if I eat this portion of pasta, I need to take 50 milligrams. So I eat this amount of cereal, I need to take 25 milligrams. If I really hog it down, I got to take 100 milligrams. So you can find out what you need to do to keep the blood sugar level with the CGM and with the use of acarbose, which is available through Ageless also as a prescription medication. Metformin and acarbose are very inexpensive. Invokana, on the other hand, is not. It's a very expensive medication. It's one of these newer drugs, and the way it works is it keeps sugar from getting absorbed back into your kidneys. So you tend to excrete more glucose. If this were available as an inexpensive generic medication, I would love to prescribe it for more people because it would allow us to eat sugar without the blood sugar spikes that we get. The metformin and the acarbose only work on starches. It doesn't do anything for eating sweets. And all of us, let's face it, we're kind of sugaraholics, most of us. It would be nice to be able to have some sugar without worrying about it. Well, this Invokana will help us do that. Problem is, it's exceedingly expensive, but it's something worth looking about. Yeah. And then
they'll go generic eventually. I mean, all medications eventually go generic. Yeah. We also have a plan to try to figure out how to get most of the benefit out of Invokana, which is canagliflozin, and without such a high price tag. It's something where we're going to be launching a small clinical trial to investigate. So stay tuned.
What doses you mean?
Well, I mean, without giving us too much away, so the cost of Invokana tablets are the same whether you get the 100 milligram or the 300 milligram. And so suggested by another one of our advisors that, if you take maybe a part of the tab like every other day or something like a half a tablet of 300 every other day, you might get most of the benefit, nearly all the benefit. Again, it's something that hasn't really been looked at yet. So we're going to be launching a small clinical trial. It's still going to be quite a bit more expensive than metformin and acarbose, but it's not going to be $600 a month, which is what these medications currently on are. So something we're going to be investigating in the next couple of months, because the very promising class of medications, we'll talk about them during the question and answer.
All right, great. And then this is the final slide. I just wanted to mention the GLP-1 agonist drugs. The first one, well, there were more than one GLP-1s, but Ozempic, a type 2 diabetes drug, a lot of the patients that were taking it for diabetes noticed they were getting significant weight loss, 10, 20, 30 pounds. So the manufacturer of Ozempic said, well, why don't we look at this as a weight loss drug? And then they developed the same medication, semaglutide, and then they gave it a different dosing schedule, and they called it Wegovy, and it is FDA approved for weight loss. So the way this works is it makes people full more quickly, decreases their appetite, has a number of beneficial effects. So once again, unfortunately, they're expensive as well, like the Invokana, but they're things that are available, and generics should be coming down the line. So with this brief introduction into glucose and insulin, why don't we begin to look at some questions?
Sure. So we have, I'm going to start with the questions that were kind of sent in beforehand. So first of all, thank you everybody for sending the questions. We've got about maybe 10 minutes left. We might be able to stress that a little bit. So I apologize if we're not going to get to all of them today. So I'll try to highlight some of the more important ones. So a question came in, are there differences in metabolic health as one ages? For example, is it different when a person is pregnant versus if they're in their 30s versus 50s versus 60s? And does your approach?
Well, absolutely. They Halloween. Look at the amount of sugar they eat. So I think that children have almost no insulin resistance, but insulin resistance develops over time. So the older you are, the more it's a problem that you have to deal with. Absolutely, it's age related.
Although the number of children and teens and preteens who have even type 2 diabetes has skyrocketed recently. Went from being, they used to call it adult onset diabetes, but now they had to change that terminology because it's no longer 100% true. You're having plenty of teenagers now and even preteens. So it just kind of goes to speak like how massive changes to our lifestyle and food choices and things like that have really put pressure. In terms of the pregnancy is, I don't want to touch on this too much, but it's a very interesting physiological state. The body becomes purposely insulin resistant on purpose, and we think it's a compensation mechanism to make sure that the baby gets first dibs on glucose before the mother. But sometimes that can be taken a little bit too far. And that's why a significant number of women end up with gestational diabetes. It's likely that they're insulin resistant to begin with, and then the natural insulin resistance that comes along with being pregnant kind of puts a woman over the edge. Usually, once they deliver, that goes into remission. But those women remain much higher risk of going on to get type 2 diabetes, 5-10 years later. So anybody who has had gestational diabetes or even maybe borderline gestational diabetes has to be all the more careful with it. All right. And then the next question, I think we kind of answered some of this. How much is in our control versus our genetics? What's your opinion on nature versus nurture?
I'm a big believer in the rule of 80-20. And when Ray Kurzweil and I began writing our first book in 2002, we believed that it was genetics 80% and lifestyle 20%. Now that we've had all of the full genome sequencing and it's inexpensive and we have a lot of more genomic data available to us, I think it's the opposite. I think it's 20% genetics and 80% lifestyle. So our lifestyle, I think genes and your genetic code is just a blueprint. It predisposes us to diseases. It doesn't mandate that we're going to get them. We can overcome virtually all of the diseases that our genetic code would predispose us to. Not 100% of the time, but most of them are just predispositions. They can be treated with diet and lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose if somebody belonged to an ethnic group that might have a higher chance, like we talked about, I think the Hispanic women had the highest risk on that graph you showed. It's just all the more reason for people to get these sorts of more advanced testings earlier potentially, and just be a little bit more aggressive with it. Otherwise, it shouldn't, regardless of your genetics, it shouldn't hinder anybody from doing some of these basic tests. Which segues actually into the next question very well. HOMA-IR. Are you familiar with that marker, and how often do you use it?
It's included. Basically, it's the area under the curve measurement. So a person will eat a food and we'll watch what their blood sugar does over time. And it gives us an idea of the IR stands for insulin resistance. So it's a useful test, and maybe even one that can supplant the glucose insulin tolerance test, which is kind of a nuisance to do. As you noted, it's real hard to get insulin levels.
Yeah, I think there are different versions of the HOMA scoring. I think this one that the patient's referring to, I think there's a calculator. If you had your fasting insulin with your fasting glucose, it's a calculation, I think, and you get like a ratio. Mm-hmm. I think if the ratio is less than 2, you're good to go. If it's more than 4, then you're in trouble, I think. Again, I think if you were to kind of like score or rank, from least effective or least informative to most informative, I think fasting glucose would probably be one of the least informative, maybe followed by A1C level, maybe followed by like fasting insulin, and then once you start getting into things like the CGM readings and the HOMA-IR score, which is that calculation, and maybe and then the kind of the cream of the crop for testing would be that oral glucose insulin tolerance test. There might be some other like academic tests out there that might be even more, but I'm saying for the general population to be able to get. So that's kind of the way I'll probably rank it. Let's see. So did you want to show us anything else on the slides, or should I continue?
No, we're done with the slides.
Okay, all right. Let's see. There's a question about Invocan, which is canagliflozin, versus metformin. The question had to do with the ITP study. So, showing that, for those people who don't know, the ITP study is a mouse study. They take 3 different groups of mice, 3 different universities. They put on various different interventions, and they see how long they live, based on these interventions. Whereas canagliflozin extended lifespan, metformin didn't seem to in these mice. So I guess the question is like, what are the differences? How would you interpret that?
Well, there's a lot of studies that show a lot of different things and conflicting results. So I know that there was a big mouse study that was also done that showed nearly 40% increase in life expectancy in mice that had metformin added to their drinking water. So you have studies going both ways. So without, having the exact details of what was involved in that study, there are some showing increased longevity and others that don't.
Yeah,
and that's
I think. Yeah, I think you always have to take mice studies with a grain of salt as well, because mice get completely different diseases than we do. They die typically of tumors and different types of tumors than what humans die from. So it's hard to make, it's a good starting point, I think. But I think we should always keep in mind that what works in mice may not work in people, and vice versa. Let's see, what else do we have here? What about metformin and intermittent fasting? How do you? I'm sure you probably get this question a lot. We do too. What's your take on that?
I think that they are complementary to one another. I do both. So at least half the days of the week, I don't eat breakfast. I try to do 4 or 5 days a week, skipping breakfast. And so I'll go for about 17 hours, 18 hours of no calories whatsoever. And then I also take 1,000 milligrams of extended release metformin every day. Some people take 1,500 milligrams. There is some discussion, maybe 1,500 is the optimal dose to take. And if you're going to take metformin, I suggest taking an extended release formulation. Seems to work better, lasts longer. In fact, it lasts about 24 hours. But I think that the benefits that come from metformin are different than the benefits that come from time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting. Both of them seem to have beneficial effects on down-regulating that mTOR1 that we want to do, upregulating what's called AMPK, upregulating adenosine monophosphate kinase is an enzyme associated with longevity. So both of those will do that. So they're complementary one another, and I think people should do both.
Yeah. And in terms of the extended release versus immediate release, I mean, we, at AgelessRx, we default to the extended release. It's easier to tolerate, it gives fewer gastrointestinal side effects. It's also easier to take. With immediate release, usually you have to take it twice a day because it doesn't last the whole day. Now there are some people who say, well, I don't want the metformin in my system when I'm doing a strenuous workout, and so therefore I'll take it maybe after my workout or during bed, and that's fine. I mean, those are some kind of like situations where we would favor immediate release if somebody really asks for it. We offer both, but I don't think, because of the extended release, I don't think it matters what time of day somebody takes it, day or night.
Exactly, with the extended release, it really doesn't. But I typically, most people don't exercise at night. More people exercise in the morning or afternoon. Some people do exercise at night, but I take my metformin at night, so I don't have the metformin interfering with. Metformin has been shown to decrease or blunt the benefits of exercise. So you don't want to take your metformin and then go out for a run.
Yeah. And then we talked about, kind of differences, male and female hormones. How does that difference potentially translate to other recommendations, such as, for example, fasting, intermittent fasting, dietary recommendations? Do you recommend the same thing to men and women, or do you have different recommendations?
Well, as a general rule, when it comes to things like, whether people should take metformin or do the CGM and then the acarbose plus or minus, I don't do any gender differentiation. I think both men and women should take metformin or look at taking metformin, should look at doing CGM testing on themselves, should look at using acarbose if needed. And then when it comes to hormone replacement, obviously, I think estrogen is great for a lot of women postmenopausally. And I think lowering estrogen is great for a lot of men postmenopausally. And I think that testosterone is great for both men and women. So, obviously there are gender-based differences, but they're all powerful anti-aging strategies. Some of the strategies we use dietary-wise are for both genders, and others are gender-specific.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just even beyond, any kind of gender differences, I think, some people tolerate intermittent fasting better than others. I don't think there's like a one size fit all for everybody.
In my personal experience, it's interesting to say that. In my personal experience, I find women tolerate, intermittent fasting a lot better.
Really? I was going to say the opposite.
Your experience is different.
I've heard from patients that women don't tolerate intermittent fasting as well. I think I don't necessarily, it's possible that anecdotal it starts to skew, and it's like, oh, I've heard, you hear for, like, let's say 5 women in a row, and all of a sudden you think all women, for example, when in fact it could be individual differences regardless of sex hormones or anything like that.
Right.
So I think there is some individual difference, and that I think that even shows up in calorie restriction data. I think there was some. I recall a study on calorie restriction where not everybody does well with it. I think it's like a 30-30-30. 30% do well on it. 30% has no effect. 30% actually decreases their lifespan. So I think when it comes to these recommendations, I would always recommend people to start with the general recommendations, but try to customize it based on their own unique physiology and circumstances.
And what you're referring to with these studies, I'm acquainted with the studies you're talking about. They're really intermittent fasting where people will go 24, 48, 72 hours or more without eating. I mean, serious intermittent fasting. What we're talking about, time restricted eating, where you skip a meal and you don't eat for 16 or 18 hours, I don't think that has a negative effect on the majority of people.
Yeah, I think the majority of people can, but I have heard from some people that like, for example, they they skip usually you skip the breakfast. So they skip breakfast, but they tend to overcompensate by overeating lunch and dinner. And that just kind of washes out the whole effect. But sometimes they can't help it. And I think, again, I don't know whether it's something about their metabolism or something about their physiology. But I mean, like I said, I tell patients start with the basics and then kind of customize it for what works for them. Let's see here. We got another question. The metformin testosterone conundrum. Have you noticed any issues with metformin or affecting testosterone levels in your clinic or your practice?
I have not, and it may be I'm missing something there. But no, I've been using both of those in my practice for 25 years, and I don't recall starting somebody on metformin and seeing testosterone levels fall or increase either way.
Yeah, it's interesting because we talked about insulin. If you think about the condition PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, it's driven by excess insulin. It's driven by insulin-resistant excess insulin, and that's why women who have PCOS, they end up getting what's called hirsutism. I think is how you pronounce it. It's been a while since I pronounced that. Yeah. So basically, they start getting facial hair and things like that, and that's driven by excess testosterone. So if you kind of translate that to men and women, if I suppose if somebody's walking around with excess insulin, which is maybe artificially inflating their testosterone, and then you put somebody on metformin or some kind of intervention that drops their insulin, you could potentially see a reduction in testosterone. But the question is that a good thing or bad? Is an elevated testosterone at any cost good? We see that in women, no, because they become infertile typically, and they end up with these cysts in their ovaries kind of as a side effect. So I think that's how I interpret some of the suggested data, or some of the data suggests that testosterone may drop how metformin may drop testosterone levels. It could also be dose dependent. I think you're doing it 500 milligrams, 1,000 milligrams, maybe 1,500 milligrams. You probably won't see much in the way. It's possible higher doses. It's possible it varies person to person. Like I said, it's possible. Like I said, it's likely. My guess is, until somebody does a study, this is only my guess, that you're dropping insulin, therefore you're dropping kind of an artificially inflated testosterone level. Mm-hmm. But definitely somebody definitely needs to gather more data on that. So next question is about sugar alcohols, like a lot of diet foods like Atkins diet and things like that include sugar alcohols in them. What's your opinion on them? Do they affect insulin levels at all? Do you generally recommend them? Avoid them?
I think they do. I think they may have some effect. By and large, sugar alcohols like erythritol and things like that are not absorbed, but they taste sweet. So a lot of dietary food products will use one of these sugar alcohols as a sweetener.